Gas and Electric Company for renewal and proposed modification of its performance-based rate-making mechanism. My name is Robert Cicero. I'm Vice Chairman of the Public Service Commission, and I'll be presiding today. Seated to my left is Chairman Smith, and by video conference is Commissioner Dr. Talina Matthews. At this time, I would normally caution attendees to please set your cell phones to silent mode or turn them off. Due to the current state of emergency in Kentucky, the Commission is hosting this hearing via video conferencing. Since this continues to be a learning experience for everyone, there are a few suggestions I would offer. In addition to the normal courtesies regarding cell phones, these tips may help with clarity and avoid feedback issues for the video conference meeting. Mute your microphone if you are not speaking. Attorneys, when interjecting, please state your name so that the video record is clear. If you use a phone for the audio and a computer for the video, turn off the computer audio, otherwise there will be feedback. If you are in a room with several people on their computers, turn off the computer audio for all but one computer, otherwise there will be feedback. If another participant is in a nearby office, close the doors between the offices. Sound carries further than one thinks, which can cause feedback. Once in the GoToMeeting software platform, go to your settings. The icon looks like a gear. To ensure the microphone setting is on the microphone you are using. There is a pull-down menu feature in GoToMeeting settings that will list the available microphones. Used wired headphones or wired earbuds for better sound quality. Wired is preferred because wireless devices may lose power depending on the length of the hearing. Keep a charger nearby in case your battery runs low. And please alert the Commission if you are experiencing technological failure that prevents your participation at any time during the procedure. Attorneys should contact staff at the previously provided cell phone number. The hearing today is for the purpose of taking evidence on Louisville Gas and Electric's application filed on December 27, 2017 in this matter. At this time, we will have the appearance of entry of counsel. Given the unique challenges of conducting a video hearing, I will also request that each party's counsel also identify their witnesses at this time. Mr. Ingram?
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm Lindsey Ingram. I'm at Stahl, Keenan, Ogden in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm external counsel for LG&E, the applicant in this matter. Today, with us, we have the two LG&E witnesses, Craig Murphy and Pam James. And just so everyone's aware of the setup here, I am at LG&E's offices in Louisville, and Mr. Murphy and Ms. James are in a conference room next to me, and they're in the same room, so they'll be using the same computer and just switching off as necessary. Also appearing for LG&E today are their internal counsel, Greg Cornett and Allison Sturgeon. Allison was just on by video feed. I don't see her now, so she may be having an issue, but she is will be attending today, as well as Mr. Cornett, as everybody can see now.
Thank you. It's my understanding that the applicant has requested and received approval to excuse two witnesses, Ms. Sharness and Mr. Jesse. I caution counsel that the Commission is granting this request and expects that the remaining witnesses be prepared to answer any questions that Ms. Sharness or Mr. Jesse would have been responsible for.
We understand, Your Honor.
For the Attorney General.
Your Honor, Michael West for the Attorney General's office.
Do you have any witnesses, Mr. West?
No, we do not have any witnesses.
For Commission staff?
Ben Bellamy and Andrew Balker, Your Honor.
Thank you. I understand that public notice has not been provided, but a motion for deviation has been filed. Is that correct?
Well, we think it has been provided, Your Honor, but we know it was not provided within the 7 to 21 day window prior to the beginning of the hearing. And so you are correct. As a result of that, we filed a motion for deviation asking for approval of the publication effort that was made. We do believe that publication occurred in all of the required 18 newspapers last week, including the Courier Journal, which we believe happened last Wednesday. But yes, that is the subject of our pending motion for deviation. We did, just so the Commission's aware, LG&E moved forward as quickly as it could with making its publication effort on the same day the order, or on the same day the order came out, rescheduling the hearing date for today.
Okay, thank you. I understand that there was an issue with the timing, and the commission is looking at the request, and I don't believe there's going to be any issue with that. So, thank you for that. So for public comment, should anyone from the public like to provide the commission with public comment? Instructions to call in are located on our website, psc.ky.gov. The phone lines will remain open for several minutes at the start of the hearing and close if there are no callers on or after everyone has an opportunity to speak. Should you call in, please state your name and address for the record before making your statement, and please keep your comments to 5 minutes or less. If there is more than one caller, please be respectful and allow one person to make a statement at a time. It should be noted that comments may always be submitted on the PSC website, psc.ky.gov. So,
I have the conference line live, and I'll check right now.
okay, thanks, Mr. Bellamy.
This is Ben Bellamy at the Kentucky Public Service Commission, and we're here at the hearing on LG&E's performance-based rate mechanism. Is anyone on the line that would like to give a comment at this time? I don't believe anyone's on the line, and we got on before the record. It indicated no one was on, and I've not heard anyone get on since. So,
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ingram, at this time you may call your first witness.
The company calls its first witness, Mr. Clay Murphy.
Mr. Murphy, will you raise your right hand, please? You swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Ingram, you may ask.
Good morning, Mr. Murphy. Did you cause to be filed written direct testimony in support of the application in this case that was filed at the end of last year?
I did.
And Mr. Murphy, were you also identified as a witness or a co-witness on a number, if not all, of the data responses that the company has filed in this matter?
That's correct.
If I were to ask you the same questions here today that were set forth in your direct testimony, would you provide the same answers?
I would.
And if I were to ask you the same questions set forth in the data requests for which you were identified, would your answers be the same?
They would.
And Your Honor, if you would indulge us for just a minute, Mr. Murphy would like to give a very short explanation as to why LG&E requested a hearing today. Is that permissible?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure.
Mr. Murphy, why did the company request a hearing in this matter?
So, as Mr. Ingram mentioned, we exchanged a lot of information through data requests and in supplemental data requests to both the Commission and to the Attorney General. We thought it would be helpful to appear face-to-face or monitor-to-monitor, however you care to look at it, to help enhance the Commission's understanding and explain the performance-based rate-making mechanism. That mechanism is a voluntary risk-reward and recommend, get tongue-tied, a voluntary risk-reward mechanism that acts as a least cost acquisition standard because of the benchmarks it contains. Those benchmarks are transparent and objective. The mechanism is the least cost, the mechanism is the cost-benefit test because to the extent that the LDC purchases gas under those benchmarks, it creates savings. To the extent that it fails to do so, expenses are created. And furthermore, there are no elements in the mechanism that act as disincentives to superior performance or that adversely impact reliability. We also requested from the Commission 4 changes to the current mechanism. Those changes were some minor housekeeping changes related to the names of the indices, the inclusion of NYMEX in the supply area indices, the changing of the sharing mechanism, and an extension for an additional 5 years. So I hope that we'll be able to discuss those, the mechanism, the benchmarks, and the changes, and in the context of this hearing with the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Your Honor, Mr. Murphy is available for cross-examination.
Mr. West?
Thank you. I just have a few questions. Good morning, Mr. Murphy.
Good morning.
You mentioned the NYMEX change. Can you just explain a little bit about how additional benchmarks expand gas supply contracting opportunities generally?
Sure. The most important way is the NYMEX is a generally recognized industry price posting. It is not included in our mechanism, and to the extent that there are supply arrangements that can be made using the NYMEX, we would like to incorporate those in the mechanism. Because that price posting is not in the mechanism, we have, although been offered some deals using the NYMEX, we have stayed away from that because it's not one of the benchmarks in the mechanism. So in short, it's another tool in the toolbox to help get lower gas costs.
Okay. Moving on from that, on page 14, I believe there's a statement, and I'm referring to the report that you submitted with the application. When it's discussing the sharing going from potentially 2575 to 3070, it says LG&E's proposed sharing mechanism will better reflect the risks inherent in the PBR mechanism when compared to risks found in PBR mechanisms of Atmos and Columbia. So can you just, again, generally talk about the risks inherent in the PBR mechanism?
Sure. So the main risk and the overarching risk in the performance-based rate-making mechanism is the fact that if there are expenses or losses, whatever term you care to use, that LG&E would share in those losses. That's the overarching risk in the mechanism. There are other subordinate risks, but the risk of incurring loss is the thing that, and the ability to get a reward is the thing that most encourages LG&E or any LDC that has a PBR mechanism to outperform the least cost acquisition standard in order to achieve savings and share in those savings.
So under the mechanism, how would losses occur?
So losses can occur simply in the most straightforward way when the benchmarks are lower than the actual costs that are incurred. So for example, I think the example that's easiest to understand is if the benchmark is $2 and you end up paying $3 for the gas, for example, you're going to incur a loss of $1 under the mechanism.
Okay.
And that loss is then shared or split, like the savings are split symmetrically within the sharing mechanism.
Okay. So over the past few years, you've been operating under a PBR that was set in 2014 case, is that right?
That's correct.
And in that case, I believe the company requested 30% share savings up to 2% with a 50-50 split above that. And they received, you received a 25% share up to 3% and 50-50 above that. You saved $20 million basically over that period, roughly, and $7 million of that went to shareholders. If you had been granted the 30% up to 2% and 50-50 above that was requested, would that have affected the amount of savings that was generated during that period?
Yes, I believe it would have, because like everything else, the greater the incentive, the greater the reward, the greater the incentive is to achieve the desired results, whether those are savings under the PBR mechanism or any other job performance, what have you. Incentives encourage superior behavior, and so that's why, in addition to the fact that that was the same sharing mechanism that Atmos and Columbia had, that's why we also asked for, in the previous case, and again in this case, asked for that same sharing mechanism.
So, if the commission were to grant a sharing mechanism going forward, are there any specific actions or decisions that you can point to that LG&E would take in order to generate additional savings that maybe it didn't take those actions or make those decisions previously?
Well, there are certainly some arrangements that we would not have, that we would be more encouraged to enter into that have greater risk. For example, we might be encouraged to release more capacity. We might be encouraged to find new and different pricing arrangements that would help us procure gas under the benchmarks. So we found that, I'll go back and explain the current mechanism. Even with the current mechanism, we entered into a number of arrangements when the sharing mechanism was changed in the last case. We entered into different arrangements than we had in the past because we were receiving a greater reward and were willing to take greater risks to achieve the savings.
I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you.
Mr. Bellamy?
Yeah. Good morning, Mr. Murphy.
Good morning.
Can you hear me okay?
I can. You're very tiny, though.
Okay, sorry about that. In your pre-filed testimony in the report that you attach, you discuss 3 components of LG&E's performance-based rate mechanism. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the first component is the gas acquisition index factor and goes by the acronym GAIF. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Out of curiosity, how do you pronounce the GAIF? Is that how you refer to it, or is there a...
That's how I refer to it, as GAIF.
I didn't know if you referred to it as a single word or something.
No.
Okay. In general terms, that component of the performance-based rate mechanism, it measures the difference between the annual benchmark gas costs and the annual actual gas costs. Is that correct?
Right. Actually, that's calculated on a monthly basis, but yes, you measure you basically create a set of billing determinants based on your actual purchases, apply the benchmarks to those, and you compare those to the actual cost that you incurred.
And you're calculating each month, and then you're adding that together to get the annual amount, correct?
Correct. Those are set forth, the monthly results are set forth in, I believe it's Appendix B of that report.
And I did have a couple questions about that, but I wanted to ask just first about, I was going to ask about the tariff itself. If you could look at just Tariff Sheet 87 attached to the application. And Brenda, if you could you bring that up on the screen? It's attached to the application. It's page 47 of the PDF of the application document. And I'll go on, Brenda. If you get that up, you can go ahead and do that. But I will just keep moving on. At the bottom of the page there, on page 87, that's where it discusses, or it kind of, LG&E's tariff kind of starts to discuss how the You can go up a little bit, Brenda. I'm sorry. It starts to discuss how the GAIF should be calculated. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, what sheet are you on?
Just tariff sheet 87. Brenda, could you scroll up a
Right,
little more?
that's the first page of the tariff sheet of the
Yes,
of the
that's
whole
the first
tariff.
page. So just 87, not 87.8. And it says there at the bottom, it says GAIF. Gas acquisition factor, and then shows how that's calculated. And then for several pages on down, it kind of explains how that GAIF will be calculated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could you look at the formula on tariff sheet 87.1?
Yes, sir.
And that's the formula for the monthly benchmark gas commodity costs.
You're talking about BMGCC?
Yes.
Okay.
And that formula there, that's basically, you said it's calculated monthly, like the benchmarks versus the actual is calculated monthly. And that BMGCC there, that's how you calculate the monthly benchmark cost. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And am I correct that that formula essentially has two parts? There's one part that calculates the monthly benchmark cost for gas purchases within the company's firm daily contract quantities, and then there's the second part calculates the benchmark cost for gas purchases that exceed the company's firm daily contract quantities.
That's correct.
And the part that is for gas purchases that exceed the firm daily contract quantities is the second part there, after the last plus sign where it says PEF DCQ times DAI. Is that correct?
Correct. Those are the purchases in excess of the firm daily contract quantities multiplied times the DAI, which is the delivered area index, which is calculated further back in the mechanism or in the tariff sheets.
And that's what it says. DAI is defined as the daily area index on page 87.4 of the tariff. Is that correct?
Well, the DAI is the delivery area index. It's calculated on a daily basis.
I apologize. I misspoke. You're correct. Delivery
It's
area
okay.
index. I said daily area index. That was one thing I was wondering. Is that calculated on a daily basis? So every time there's purchases on a day above the firm daily contract quantities, then you'll calculate that DAI for that specific day. And it could happen 30 days in a month, or it might happen just 2 days in a month. Is that how that works?
That's correct.
Okay.
That portion of the mechanism helps us do two things. To the extent that we can contract for delivered supplies to meet needs that are in excess of our pipeline entitlements in the form of delivered supplies delivered directly to our city gate. That helps us to avoid pipeline capacity that may not be needed except under more extreme circumstances. So actually, we look at that as a benefit to the mechanism because it helps keep down a lot of fixed costs that are spread out over time and only incur those costs when they're really needed, and then have a benchmark to benchmark those costs.
So I had a question. My question was about how, I'm sorry, did you have something else?
No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
My question was about how the benchmark rate is calculated. So, and I'm talking about the delivery area index. So it says the the daily DAI applicable to the daily purchases made to Citygate delivery shall be higher of the following of either. And then it has two formulas for calculating the DIA or the DAI. And the only variable that's different in those formulas is the DAI TGT1 versus the TGT2, which is referring to, those are defined below, but effectively the midpoint in those zones on those particular transmission pipelines, correct?
So TGT stands for Texas Gas Transmission, and the -1 is from Zone 1, and the -4 is from Zone 4. So those are the opposite ends of Texas Gas's system.
Okay.
And so what we're calculating there is we're calculating the price from that zone, using the benchmark from that zone, grossing it up for retention, adding the commodity charges, and if there's any demand charges associated with that, we're using that to benchmark that cost for just that one day's purchase. And so you're taking the higher of those two, because sometimes sometimes the Zone 1 is higher, sometimes the Zone 4 is higher. It depends on when it's calculated.
I guess
I would also add that this is consistent with the cash out mechanism that we use in our transportation tariffs.
Okay. My main question is, why use the higher of the two as the benchmark?
As I explained, because sometimes one zone is higher than the other.
No, I realize that, but if you're using the higher of the two, would you then not be able to just purchase gas on a daily rate from the cheaper one, and then there would always be a savings?
Well, as I mentioned before, the number of times that this portion of the mechanism is used is very infrequent. But what it does do is it helps us to avoid contracting for year-round or seasonal pipeline capacity. And so it helps us avoid a lot of costs, not incur costs. I'm still not sure that answered your question, but.
Well, my question is just, if you're setting the mechanism up so that the benchmark is the higher of two possible locations where you can purchase the gas on a daily basis, wouldn't you always have a savings because you're choosing the higher one, and then you would just buy it from the cheaper one, and then there would always be an incremental savings between those two?
Well, if you knew that going into it, unfortunately, many times you don't know until after the fact which of these price postings are available after the fact, not before the transactions are entered into. So you don't necessarily know which zone is going to be the lower zone. You don't know that you're going to beat the benchmark at all in this case.
Okay.
These benchmarks aren't available to us until after we perform the transaction. So I wish I knew beforehand where the cheapest gas was going to be on a given day or from a given zone, but I don't know that.
I mean, when you're purchasing gas on a daily basis, though, would you check the price at each pipeline in each zone to determine, what the price is there before you purchased it, or is it just? I guess I'm not necessarily sure how that works. If you wouldn't know the price before you actually purchased it.
Typically we'll purchase at an index price, and the index is not posted till the following day.
So you don't know the price you're purchasing it for until after you purchase it?
In many cases, that's the case, yes. That's part of the risk of the mechanism that we operate under. Is that the indices are not posted until after the transactions are completed.
I guess I would be confused then. If you don't know the price, then I would be somewhat confused as to how that this would then operate as an incentive if you're basically going into it blind.
It operates as an incentive because it helps us avoid, absent this ability to benchmark delivered area supplies, the company would be required to enter into firm pipeline capacity on a seasonal or year-round basis, which is infinitely higher than, or orders of magnitude higher than, the few number of transactions that we've had to ensure that we've maintained reliability under the mechanism. So in a way, this feature of this delivery area index helps us maintain reliability to supply customers, but it lets us do so in a way that's cheaper, more cost effective, whatever word you care to use, than if we had subscribed to firm pipeline capacity.
Let me ask you a question. So you're saying that you're generating savings based on a price that you don't know about until the following day, but you're saying that that provides a savings because it's cheaper than whatever a committed price would be through the transmission line? I mean, based on that, then wouldn't you do everything on a daily basis because the long-term agreements are more expensive?
You're talking about under this portion of the mechanism or under the mechanism as a whole?
I'm talking under this portion of it. Couldn't you move more off the other portion of it and move it into this?
Then I think that you do create some risk under the mechanism by relying entirely on a third party to supply you with delivered area supplies.
I understand the reduced risk by having a confirmed supplier. What I don't understand is talking about a portion of the formula that really there is no, other than the quantity, there's no decision by LG&E because you don't know what the price is, but you're hoping it generates savings.
Well, I think you have to remember that as a local distribution company, our needs are fairly price insensitive. So we can't decide whether or not we're willing to pay a price or not pay a price under the mechanism. We have to get the gas that the customer needs when the customer needs it, really irrespective of the price. And so I think that's the most important thing to remember, not the fact that, oh, the price is $2 today. I think that's too high. I would rather pay $1.90. That's not what we're charged to do, and that's not what the mechanism does.
Well, if you were to look at the amount of savings that were generated over the last 4 years, how much would be attributed to this portion of the formula?
I do not know that number. We can provide that.
Can you?
Yeah, I'll ask that as a post-hearing data request.
All right, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Bellamy. Go ahead.
When you look at the supply of the other component of the formula, where you use the supply area index factor, when you're calculating the supply area index factor, which is kind of the corresponding component to the delivery area index, would you agree with that?
Correct. Those are in the supply area, and this is in the delivered area. That's correct.
So the supply area index factor, you take an average of or I guess
We take an average.
you take an average of different price listings, and for that zone. I was curious, why not with the DIA? Why would you not use some sort of average of the two to determine the actual what should be the benchmark, because then you've got the midpoint, and if you beat it, you beat it, but if you don't beat it, then you don't.
Okay, so I think there's perhaps many questions there. The delivery area index has to be constructed because there is no posted index available for gas that's delivered to LG&E's city gate. So we're constructing that benchmark from the available information that we have. We're looking at the price in, just for the sake of simplicity, Texas Gas's Zone 1. We're grossing that up for fuel retention, which is necessary to get it from the supply area to the delivered area. Then we add the commodity charges and any demand. So we're constructing a rate up from the supply area to the city gate. In the case of, and again, the activity under this portion of the mechanism, while I don't know the exact number, has been very small and very limited. The activity, and occurs only for, subject to check, I believe it's only occurred for a handful of days during the course of the mechanism. I could be wrong, but I don't believe I am. These other purchases in the supply area, so for the supply area indices that you see on sheets
87.3.
87.2, 87.3. These purchases go on day in and day out over the course of the year because we don't experience peak conditions very often, right? Those are few and far between. And so this is for the bulk of our activity occurs under the supply area indices. And again, the delivered area index is basically allows us to avoid a lot of costly pipeline capacity on a handful of days that in some years may never occur.
Okay. I mean, I think I understand what you're saying.
Did I answer your question? I'm sorry if I didn't.
I mean, I think I understand, but I'll move on. With respect to the DAI, you only use two benchmark rates. You use the Texas Gas Transmission Zone 1 and Texas Gas Transmission Zone 4, but for the SAI, you use a combination, basically 5 different rates, 3 on the Texas Gas transmission line and then 2 on the Tennessee line. Is there a reason why there's only 2 in the DAI and then there's 5 up above in the SAI?
Well, the supply area indexes or indices reflect where LG&E has firm receipt point entitlements, the zones where LG&E has or can have firm entitlements. So in Texas Gas's Zone 1, Texas Gas's Zone SL, Texas Gas's Zone 4, Tennessee's Zone 0, Tennessee's Zone 1. The delivery area index is trying to construct what the price is at LG&E's city gate. And again, those indexes aren't published, so we're trying to create. So if your question is, why aren't we trying to do the same construction using the other indexes? Basically, it's for the sake of simplicity and because there's a lack of frequency of use of this part of the mechanism, despite its importance in keeping pipeline costs down. And as I mentioned, it is also consistent with how we cash out end user transportation. And I think you have to remember that the bulk of our supplies are taken from Texas Gas. So it's probably the most pertinent way to construct the delivery area index.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to confirm is it's not because you couldn't take the gas on a daily basis from those other pipelines in the other zones. It's because you're saying it's ease of use and because you get most of your gas from the Texas gas transmission line. Is that correct?
Certainly the second one, ease of use, I think it's simplicity in constructing the mechanism. You could do these same calculations and use the other zones. You could use Tennessee's Zone 0, Tennessee's Zone 1, and Texas Gas's Zone SL and do the same construction. And I feel confident you would get slightly different answers.
Okay.
But as I said, this portion of the mechanism has benchmarked very small portion of the actual gas that's been taken by LG&E at its city gate, whether that's delivered or through the pipeline capacity that we hold on the interstate pipelines.
With respect to the SAI component, you've got up above, the SAI fits into the formula up above in the tariff, but then you have 5 different ways to calculate the SAI, and that's basically, it's based on the various pipelines. It's there on tariff page 87.2 and 87.3.
Yes, sir. So those 5 places are the places where LG&E has or does have or hold capacity, have or held capacity.
So my question is, those locations are basically where you have capacity, like firm contract capacity, and you mentioned that one of the reasons you use the Texas gas transmission line with respect to the DAI is because that's where you get most of your gas.
That's correct.
And if you look there, I'm looking at, just as an example, SAI TGT-SL, which is one of the zones on the Texas gas transmission line, correct?
That's correct.
And then you have the various ways in which you're going to calculate that benchmark rate. You're using, one is the average weekly natural gas gas price report. Then you've got the second one and the third one. The first 3 of those, are all of the prices listed in those, are they all related to the actual price on the Texas gas transmission line at Zone SL?
They are.
When you add in the 4th, the New York Mercantile Exchange settled closing price, is that based on the actual price on that transmission line in that zone?
That's based on the price at the Henry Hub, which is in Texas Gas's Zone SL, and I believe it's in Tennessee's Zone 1. I'm not positive about that.
So, forgive me for not being familiar with how the New York Mercantile Exchange lists rates or how this is listed. Is this like a composite rate, like a national composite rate, or is the New York Mercantile Exchange, is it giving a rate for each zone also?
It's giving a rate for transactions that settle at the Henry Hub, which is in South Louisiana, which is Texas Gas's Zone SL.
But it gives one rate, correct?
It's a single posting. That's correct.
So I guess my question is, if the purpose of this is to kind of get an average of the gas price at these various locations, why use the one that might be in one of the zones but it's not in all of the zones?
Because this New York Mercantile Exchange price posting is a nationally recognized price posting that's cited in terms of price direction. It's cited in terms of price settlement for a given month, where prices may be going, and it's commonly used as a way to construct or bid out through RFPs or otherwise transactions.
When it says New York Mercantile Exchange settled closing price for the prompt month, what does that mean to you, the prompt month?
So the NYMEX will close on 3 days before the end of let's just pick a month of December. It will close, I don't know what 3 business days are, but we'll just call it the 27th. It will close that day, November the 27th, for example, for the month of December. So December is the prompt month. It's the next month. The NYMEX prices trade out for a series of months, but the prompt month is the month that's getting ready to come up to us. So another example, this is June. Along about the 26th or 27th of June, the NYMEX will close for July, and it will go off the board. That price will have closed. So the prompt month in that example is July.
Before you decided to include the New York Mercantile price, did you look to see how the New York Mercantile price compared to the other listings for the various zones?
Yes.
And was the New York Mercantile price, was that typically a lower price, or was it typically a higher price than the other listings?
Each of the zones bear a different relationship to the NYMEX. So some trade at a bigger discount, some trade at a premium, depending on where your location is. For the 5 zones that we've quoted, the zonal price tends to trade at a discount to the NYMEX.
Did you look at whether or not, historically, if the NYMEX had been included, whether or not there would have been more or less savings reflected in the PBR?
Yes, we calculated those numbers.
What was the result?
I don't know them off the top of my head, but we can provide those in a post-hearing data response.
Okay. Do you know whether or not it was more or less savings?
It was more.
Okay. And we'll ask that as a post-hearing data request.
Okay, that's great.
If the commission eliminated just the GAIF component of the performance-based rate mechanism, would LG&E do anything differently in procuring its gas?
Oh, I think drastically different.
What would LG&E do differently if just the GAIF component of the performance-based rate mechanism was eliminated?
It's just the GAIF was deleted. I think that we tried to respond to those in one of the data requests. If you look at, I believe it's PSC 1-4, starting on the second and the third pages, we listed a number of things that we would stop doing. So, and we would fall back to the least cost acquisition standard, which is the market-based. So these are things that help us achieve costs less than the benchmarks. And so because our standard would then move from trying to achieve savings beneath the benchmarks to just the least cost acquisition standard to the market clearing rates, these things that help us get below that, we would stop doing, in part because there would no longer be a benchmark against which to measure anything.
I guess the purpose of the PBR is in part to incentivize the purchase of the least cost gas. Is that correct?
I think the purpose of the PBR mechanism is to establish benchmarks that act as the least cost acquisition standard, and then incent the company to outperform those benchmarks to achieve performance superior to the least cost acquisition standard.
But I mean, the least cost is going to me, the least cost is the least cost. Is that not correct? I mean, you can't really get below the least cost.
Well, if you look at what the commission has said in the past, and it's in that same data response, LDC should maintain their objective of procuring wholesale natural gas supplies at market clearing prices within the context of maintaining balanced natural gas supply portfolio that balances objectives of obtaining low-cost gas supplies, minimizing price volatility, and maintaining reliability of supply. So that is, in its entirety, the least cost acquisition standard. Because you can get something lower than least, but it may not be reliable. And so you take away the incentive to outperform the commission's directive, the least cost acquisition standard, the prudent standard, whatever words you care to use, that basically summarize what the commission said in Administrative Case 384, you fall back to just the generalized market clearing prices. And so market clearing prices could be purchasing gas a day at a time, foregoing purchasing monthly supplies.
I mean, do you think it'd be prudent for an LDC to purchase gas a day at a time, though?
I believe that's what many LDCs do.
But do you think that that would be prudent to do that? That's, I guess, with respect to just purchasing the gas, I mean, when you're determining which gas to purchase, what are you all typically doing on a daily basis? And I'm just talking about just the gas cost itself, not the transmission costs or things like that.
I understand. So, but you can't ignore the transportation costs. But under the PBR mechanism, what we're doing to decide where we're going to buy the gas, we look at the contracts that we have available, that we have entered into. So what contracts do we have that have first of month prices? What contracts do we have that are daily priced? We look at where those supplies originate, what zone they are in, and what has been their relationship either in the past or the immediate past, like yesterday, and then try to make a decision about what we think tomorrow will look like in terms of, do we think that we would be best off to dispatch our first of month contracts or our daily contracts, and if so, from what zone? I think the best, one of the data responses helps to explain that in some detail, if you would give me.
I guess I don't want to interrupt you, but those things you just mentioned, would you continue to do those things even if the PBR for the GAF portion didn't exist?
If the GAIF didn't exist, there would not be any transparent or objective benchmarks against which to assess performance. So if you look at our data response number 2, page 2 of 6, it shows how we try to purchase the least cost. It doesn't always mean that we can purchase the least cost, but we try to maximize our contracts in a way that assures that we get of what we have available to us, that we get the lowest cost. So you can see there in example 1 where we're trying to maximize the price and by taking daily gas, or example 2 where we're trying to maximize the price, I meant maximize the savings, or we're trying to maximize the savings by taking the first of the month contract. If you look further back into that data response on page 5.
Mr. Murphy, let me interrupt for just a second. I just want to make sure the record is clear that you're referring to PSC question 1-2 on page 2 of 6. Sorry for interrupting, but I just want to clear that.
That's right. That's correct. Yes. And so if you look on page 5 of 6, there we show a much more complex example, but one that actually happened for the month of November. And so you see here we have, and this gives you, this is really in response to your question, what are we looking at? We're looking at all these things. The relation, but these prices are posted after the fact that create the benchmark. So we're looking at what are our first of month opportunities, which is basically the straight line that goes, the 4 straight lines that go across the graph there. We're looking at our daily opportunities, which prices. So you look at this, you see the green line is lower at the beginning of the month, but the orange line is lower at the end of the month. So we're trying to maximize our savings by picking the lowest cost. Unfortunately, we can't always do that, right? Because sometimes when the price is low, there is no demand. So we don't need the gas. As I mentioned earlier, our needs are price insensitive. So when there's no demand, it doesn't really matter how cheap the gas is, we can't buy it. And when there is demand, if you look there in that chart, sort of towards the beginning, between like the 6th and the 12th of the month, you can see there's a lot of demand. You can't avoid purchasing gas higher than the 1st of the month.
I guess I just am not getting the point that you would stop doing those things if the GIF portion, or why you would stop doing them, just because that portion of the performance-based rate mechanism was eliminated.
Because there would only be a least cost acquisition standard at that point. The benchmarks act as the least cost acquisition standard. We're incented to beat the least cost acquisition standard, to beat the benchmarks to achieve saving. If the mechanism goes away, if there are no incentives, if there are no rewards for the risks that are taken, there would be no behavior.
And the primary
We're likely to not purchase gas at market clearing rates a day at a time. That would fulfill the standard of least cost acquisition.
If the GIF went away and you all stopped doing these things, would there be any savings in terms of operating expenses?
No. O&M costs are recovered through base rates. Those costs recover the what of what we do. The purchasing of gas, the purchasing of transportation capacity. The mechanism creates the how. And it creates the how because there's an incentive. And so what happens would continue to happen. The how would go away because the mechanism would go away.
So let me ask you a quick question. You're referring to the fact that there's no cost savings. The ratepayers are already paying for whatever resources are necessary to generate the savings. There will be no benefit savings to them should the mechanism go away. So shareholders participate in the savings of which you're proposing to increase, but there's no cost incurred by LG&E to generate these savings because ratepayers are already paying for it. And they will not do as good a job as they were doing before because there's no incentive. Is that correct?
I think I disagree with the premise of that question, as I think you probably would expect. And what goes away because the incentive goes away. The how goes away. The how goes away because there is no longer a risk-reward mechanism, so that the risk the company takes or undertakes under the PBR mechanism goes away. So if there is no reward for the risk that's undertaken, then there would not be any risk undertaken.
So how often?
You fall back to the least cost acquisition standard.
When you
Mr. Vice Chairman, if I may interrupt for just 1 second. I just want everyone to be aware that when you speak, you are not on camera. The PSC's hearing room camera is focused on an empty chair. So I just raise it for record purposes so that we'll know it's you speaking. I know your voice very well, but not all might know that.
Okay, we'll see if, there we go. That better?
Perfect. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so going back to the question about risk, how often has LG&E suffered a loss because of risks that they've taken in generating these savings?
So if you look back at, and we're speaking about the gas acquisition index factor, if you look back at Appendix B of the report, it shows the monthly activity under the mechanism. And so it shows various months as you move through the 4 years that are included in the report that include losses. And also, I think you will recall one of the data responses where we were asked to calculate what percent, I'm sorry, I don't recall off the top of my head which question that was. Maybe Mr. Lindsay can help me there, where we calculated the percentage of the transactions that actually lost money, and that was 23% of the transactions we entered into. Importantly, 77% of the transactions made money under the mechanism. So there is, for lack of a better term, the mechanism is not a sham. The mechanism encourages behavior that produces costs that are lower than the least cost acquisition or prudence standard.
If you eliminated the DAI portion of the savings that were, or the loss that was generated for LG&E, how much of those would be responsible for the 23% that actually were transactions that incurred a loss?
As I said, I don't know that number, but we can get you that number.
Okay, fair enough,
Did you want to ask that as a post-hearing data request?
yes.
Okay.
I think he said that he would provide it, so certainly.
So that post-hearing data request really relates to that particular one, relates to the DAI, the activity that we've had, and whether there have been losses or savings under that portion, and what percent of the, or what part of the 23%, if those were losses, I have no idea whether they were losses or savings, what part of those were included in the 23%.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
Yes, I think my question pertains to the fact that I understand the company is predicating this change, or we're continuing this mechanism based on the fact that there's savings that are generated, and that without those incentives, the company would not be willing to take as much risk. And I'm interested in just how much risk is actually taken, and what type of reward needs to be provided in order to continue making those transactions that apparently generate all these savings. So I'm just interested in seeing how much risk is actually taken, or if it's a matter of there's really not that much risk. Natural gas volatility has gone way down, and some of the proposals here, I'm not sure when you talk about increasing percentages or changing the mechanism in order to, like adding NYMEX, it would probably add more savings in a situation where the risk on gas pricing doesn't seem to be as much as it was when these PBRs were first put into place. And I think that's where the commission is right now, is to try to determine whether PBRs are still relevant given the current climate of natural gas pricing. That's what we're trying to find out.
I think that's a good question. So I would refer you to, I believe it was there's a nice chart in, I believe it was 2- if you bear with me for a moment, 2-1, I think. Could have been in 1-1, I'm not sure. If you bear with me just a moment.
You mentioned before the data response that refers to losses. And I think what you wanted me to remind you there was PSC 1-7, okay?
Oh, that's the one that calculates the 23%,
Yes, sir.
Lindsay?
Yes, sir.
So if you look at, I've now found this chart that I was looking for. It's in, and I may ask you, Mr. Cicero, to repeat part of your question because it had many parts in there. But
Well,
if we could go to, firstly, go to PSC 1-1 on page 2 of 9.
I think my initial question, and probably what this table refers to, had to do with, of the 23% of transactions that reflected a loss, how many were related to the DAI portion of the calculation and the daily transactions of those 23%?
Right. And I don't know that, but I promise to get that to you.
Okay, so is that what this table refers to?
So no, this table refers to, you were talking about prices and volatility and whether or not the PBR was relevant or not. So if you look at the beginning of the table, there in the very first column, it says average annual NYMEX settle price. And this is it's just a benchmark, whether or not it's included. And I don't intend to mean that in the context of the mechanism, but it's just a recognized price index that covers the United States. So if you look at the beginning when the benchmark was, or when the PBR mechanism was approved, you have prices there at 96 and 97 that were $2.60. If you look at 2019, you have prices, you show a price of $2.62. So the PBR is as relevant now as it was then. The PBR is not related to suppressing price volatility or owing to some kind of high prices. The high prices occurred in the intermediate years under subsequent mechanisms, and they produced the benefits that they produced. So the fact that the price has come down is really more interesting, and the fact is the price has come down to where it was 22 years ago when the mechanism started.
If I was to look at the price of gasoline back in '95 and I compared it to 2019, it would probably be similar as well, but we would all agree that there's been price fluctuations that occur in the middle that made these calculations much more relevant than they appear to be today. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I would not agree. Because the PBR mechanism is intended not to suppress the price. The PBR mechanism is intended to encourage the LDC to exceed the least cost acquisition standard, to have performance that's superior to that, irrespective of what the price is. Not because the price is high, irrespective of what the price is.
And I understand your comment. From my perspective, I would say that it's always the provider's obligation to go with the least cost. And that's their fiduciary responsibility. That's their job for their ratepayers, regardless of whether there's incentive or not. That's why when you go back and refer
And
to
I would agree with that.
Well, please don't interrupt me,
I would-
okay? I wasn't done talking.
I'm sorry.
My comment was, so when you talk about this obligation to the ratepayers who are incurring the expense for your resources to generate these savings, it's already there and it's not going to go away either way. It's the company's responsibility to make sure, and their responsibility to their ratepayers to generate savings if they can do it. And that's why the risk factor is such an important part of it. How much risk is LG&E really exposed to do this service that they're doing? I think that's where the commission is right now. Now you can go ahead and respond.
And so how in the absence of benchmarks can you measure whether the least cost acquisition is being performed or not? That to me is an important question. Once you take the PBR mechanism away, once you take the benchmarks away, there's not a way to assess the performance in the same way that the PBR mechanism provides, because the PBR mechanism contains these transparent and objective benchmarks. You take the benchmarks away, you can't assess performance. You take the savings, the potential to incur savings or expenses away, you take away the incentive part of the mechanism that encourages the LDC to exceed or to have performance that's superior to the benchmarks. And so I think the commission looks at a string of years where the performance has produced positive results as a negative, that somehow that the mechanism is a sham, that somehow the mechanism is not really doing anything. And really what, having lived this, really what the mechanism does is encourage us, and from my perspective, very successfully encouraged us to beat the least cost acquisition standard.
I don't think there's any question that benchmarks can remain in place internally without a savings being generated. You refer to the benchmarks going away, and how do you measure performance? There's nothing that says you can't measure against NYMEX or whatever other zone from Texas gas that you utilize. You can always measure that. You can use it as an internal incentive for your staff. I mean, there's nothing that says those have to go away. You're just saying that you need those in order to generate the savings. And I guess my question is, my question is, if you're going to generate savings, you're even proposing that the savings be increased to other companies that are providing services and their PBRs. And I understand the desire to have the same measurement system in order to generate a benefit for shareholders. But this is coming at the same time that the commission is looking at those other providers and their PBR mechanisms to see whether they're fair or reasonable given today's environment. So it'll be interesting on a risk versus benefit analysis to see where we come out with this.
Well, as I said before, the mechanism is the cost-benefit analysis. The cost-benefit analysis is not a comparison of the savings that are achieved under the mechanism to the cost to purchase natural gas that are embedded in base rates. That's not what the cost-benefit test is. The cost-benefit test is, can you exceed the benchmarks that are established?
Mr. Bellamy?
Yes.
Jumped in the middle of your cross-examination. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I was actually going to move on and just ask about the transmission index factor, Mr. Murphy.
Sure.
And that's the second. You mentioned earlier when I was asking questions, there's three components to the PBR, and one of the second one is the transmission index factor, correct?
Sure. I just want to get the tariff sheets in front of me if you
That's fine.
give me a moment. Lots of pieces of paper here.
So Brenda, you can go ahead and pull that up, I guess, while he's pulling that. It's
So that starts on 87.5.
87.5, yes. Okay. And just in general terms, again, this component of the performance-based rate mechanism measures the difference between the annual benchmark gas transportation costs and the annual actual gas transportation costs. And again, that's calculated on a monthly basis, and then you get the annual amount. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
So in the same way, you create, you have your actual determinants. You apply in this case, the tariff rates against the determinants, to create your benchmark and then subtract your actual costs from that to determine whether there were savings or expenses.
And would you agree that the benchmark gas transportation costs for each pipeline include the demand contracted for at the tariff rate, the actual volumes of gas delivered at the tariff rate, and then actual cost of certain surcharges, direct bills, and other amounts approved by FERC?
That's correct.
And that's
You're
there.
referring to the equations at the top of 87.6.
Yes, that's correct. So the TPDR is the tariff demand rate. The DQ is the contracted for demand. The TPCR is the tariff, volumetric rate.
Correct.
And then the AV is the actual volumes delivered at the company city gates, correct?
That's correct.
And then S and DB is the other thing I mentioned, which was the surcharges and other amounts authorized by FERC.
Correct.
So, could you look at, this is the application, the report, it's attached to the application, the report Appendix B to the report. And I believe, Cabrina, it's page 36 of the PDF in which the application is included. So it's on the same document as the tariff. Thank you.
I think it's just immediately before it, isn't it?
Yeah. Excuse me. Just look, if you could look at page 5, which is the last page of that Appendix B. And
Okay.
the monthly amounts there, so that second column, the PBR TIF, that's basically the monthly savings under the TIF portion of the performance-based rate mechanism, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then if you notice there in 2018, or the year beginning, I guess, November 2018, the amount each month was basically exactly the same, correct?
That's correct.
And that's because the benchmark is the contracted demand and contracted volume at the tariff rates, but then LG&E has long-term contracts for those exact amounts that are actually lower than the tariff rate. Is that correct?
Right. That reflects, the short answer to your question is that reflects the discount to the demand charges that we've received
Okay.
in that year.
And that's because, and the reason it's the same every month is because there's long-term contracts in place.
Right. There was a discount that was entered into let me make sure I get my facts squared away. So yes, in the year we're looking at, year 22, the amounts there were the result of the tariff rates that were in effect that year, and at that point it was a brand new discounted transportation arrangement with Tennessee Gas Pipeline.
Okay. And if this is...
You'll see in prior years that those amounts are different amounts, or in some cases they're different during the months depending on some other factors. But in the one side here is fine.
Would you agree that that amount remains pretty consistent month to month, though? Even going back all 4 years of the historic period shown on Appendix B?
Well, maybe your idea of consistent is different than my idea of consistent, but if you go back to year 19, which is page 2 of the Appendix B, so I'm not sure what page you're on now.
That's page 5.
That's page 5, so if you go up a couple pages to 19.
That was the correct page. Go ahead, you can scroll down.
So yeah, so 19. So here you can see that there are varying amounts in varying months. Part of that's dependent because in that particular year, we had some transactions which included commodity discounts, or we were releasing capacity in the next. If you look at the next page, you can see that there were different amounts in some of the months because of, again, capacity release transactions that were going on in year 20. In year 21, you can see that there's different amounts in at least one month that I'm glancing at, and that was because of capacity release activity. So
the savings is...
they haven't consistently been, I would add, I guess, they haven't consistently been the number that you're showing here, $204,716.
No, I understand that. I meant, it seems like year to year they're relatively consistent, and I'm assuming that's based on the contracted demand savings, and then occasionally you'll have a capacity release which will have an additional savings. Is that pretty accurate?
That's correct.
So
And what's also driving that is not just the level of the discount, and during the course of these 4 years that were shown here, the level of the discount changed in the last year, year 22. But what's also driving that is the level of the pipeline tariff. So these savings in this case, in this, I don't mean this case, but in this example, are also driven by the tariff rates of the pipeline, and they're driven by basically our discount with Tennessee Gas Pipeline. And those rates are reviewed and established by FERC. In the case of Tennessee, and FERC has the jurisdiction to establish those rates.
So FERC,
They have the knowledge and expertise to establish those rates. And the regulation they provide is a default, basically the tariff rate is a default market rate that occurs when there's inadequate competition or where one of the parties has monopoly power. In the case of Texas Gas and Tennessee, both their rates have recently been reviewed by FERC as a part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We do not receive a discount from Texas Gas. Texas Gas's rates were reviewed by FERC and were not changed. Tennessee's rates were reviewed by FERC, and a settlement was put in place that's outlined in one of the footnotes of the report that established a series of reductions in the tariff rate over time. So very different set of circumstances between the two pipelines.
and I understand that. And the tariff rate that's used for the benchmark, that's the tariff rate that's established by FERC, correct?
That's correct.
And then with respect to the discounted contracts, those are filed with FERC, but not necessarily approved. They can be filed and they might be disapproved, or they might just be allowed to be placed into effect. Is that correct?
My belief is that FERC gives the pipelines discretion, considerable discretion, in granting discounts or not granting discounts. Discounts are voluntary. They're not obligatory. And so there's nothing to obligate, and Texas Gas is a perfect example. Texas Gas has been unwilling to discount their transportation services, and Tennessee has been willing to discount their transportation services.
How long has Tennessee Gas Pipeline been discounting transportation services for LG&E? Do you know?
In varying degrees, since 96, 6, I believe.
And was that like 1 year before the PBR was placed into effect?
That's correct.
Can you just kind of explain to me, how does LG&E negotiate a reduction in the transportation rate below the FERC rate?
In its simplest form, we ask the pipelines for proposals for rates on their capacity.
So you
And
would
that's in response to the incentives that's provided under the PBR mechanism.
So you do a request for proposal, and then you might have multiple pipelines to which you'll have access to respond, and if one of them gives you a reduced rate that happens to be lower than all the tariff rates, then you'll accept that one, provided that they can actually provide the gas.
Well, multiple pipelines. We have only 2 pipelines that we have access to,
Okay.
Texas Gas and Tennessee. And those are evaluated at the time the capacity rolls off the board or is getting ready to roll off the board, however you want to look at that, in advance of the contract being subject to termination. And so the pipelines or pipeline responds to the capacity. So you ask a question and I'm not sure what you're asking, but we don't evaluate the bids in the context of which produces the greatest savings under the PBR mechanism. We ask the question, which produces of the alternatives that we have, which produces the lowest rate?
Okay. So if a discounted rate of one pipeline was actually still higher than the tariff rate of the other pipeline, you would still go with the other pipeline even though it wouldn't generate savings under the PBR?
I agree with the second part. I'm not sure I understood the first part, but
I guess the question,
can I repeat it back?
My understanding of what you said is you get a bid in, and like say you get a bid in for the Tennessee pipeline and it's a discounted from the Tennessee tariff rate, but it still happens to be higher than the Texas transmission line rate. You would still go with the Texas transmission line if they could serve your capacity, because
Yes, unless there was some unique operational reason that, because despite the fact that we're connected to 2 pipelines and we're getting somewhat on sensitive territory here, but despite the fact that we're connected to 2 pipelines, the capacity that they provide is not necessarily interchangeable.
and you don't have to go in any more detail. I don't want to go into confidential. And if something gets into confidential, just let me know. I was trying to be non-specific.
Thank you. So I will have to say, I think one thing that's important to consider is why is the discounted rate not the appropriate benchmark? The discounted rate is not the appropriate benchmark because those are offered on a voluntary basis by the pipeline. The pipeline can cease to provide you with a discount for whatever business reason they choose. And because we were able to achieve a discount under one set of circumstances does not mean we can necessarily achieve a discount in a different time or a different place. In fact, one of the data responses, I believe, would go back to PSC 1-1. We sort of talk about that on page 6 of 9, and it talks about how changing demands can create more competition for pipeline transportation capacity. So we have not only LDCs or the traditional pipeline capacity takers, but we have electric generators and LNG exporters who are taking up increasing amounts of capacity. So just because the pipeline discounted rates to a certain level in the past does not mean that that's where they will discount those rates to in the future. So in Tennessee, we have sort of two sets of circumstances. One is increasing demand for pipeline capacity to export gas to Mexico in the form of LNG, and we have a tariff settlement, which would, all things equal, tend to drive prices up. We have a tariff rate settlement in effect. It's described in the footnote in the application that is actually causing rates to go down, tariff rates to go down. So we have not a diverging set of rates, but a converging set of rates.
I understand. And if this isn't a confidential, let me know, but with respect to the gas supply or the transmission contracts, is there a typical term that those contracts would have? I'm assuming it could be any term, but is there something that's pretty normal as far as what the terms have been historically?
Partly those are driven by some tariffed considerations. So I'm now speaking with respect to Texas Gas's no-notice rate. There are provisions in the no-notice service, which again is not discounted by Texas Gas, which encourage us to have a 5-year term. And so in that 5-year term, that provides us some protection because we have a unilateral termination right, the right of the pipeline. This is not confidential, this is a tariff. If you have a 5-year term, you have a unilateral termination right. And so we've always looked at that as very important, that the pipeline could not terminate the capacity on us, that we had, and we only had that right. So for those no-notice agreements that we have 5-year terms. We also have, if I could beg your indulgence for just one moment.
Sure.
Give me some water, please, before thank you. Get a little dry, I'm sorry. So we also have another Texas Gas transportation service. Our no-notice service comes from Zone SL up to our city gate in Zone 4 and includes a storage entitlement on the pipeline, which is why it's called no-notice. We also have some regular FT service that allows us to bring gas from the Marcellus and the Utica at a determination of Texas Gas's system in Lebanon, Ohio. That contract was entered into in it became effective in 2016, and it had a 10-year term, and we adopted a 10-year term because it was essentially, thank you, it was the only way we would be able, under the Texas Gas's open season, to obtain that capacity. So Texas Gas set as a, what word am I looking for? Requirement when they conducted that open season that parties interested in capacity from Lebanon, which again brings Marcellus and Utica gas south, that they must enter into a contract at a fixed rate, which was the same as the tariff rate, under a negotiated rate agreement, and it must be for a term of 10 years. So in that case, we have a contract that's 10 years long. In the case of Tennessee, they have the rate schedule we take capacity from them under is called Rate FT. It is, for all intents and purposes, the same as Texas Gas's Rate FT in terms of the kinds of services that are embodied in the tariff. in that contract, we've had different terms on those contracts. I believe the term, this is a 5-year term. I believe the term that we had before this was 4 years. And honestly, I can't remember any further back than that. So the term varies.
But they're generally a number of years, basically, at least.
We've also had, I will tell you, back in, we'd have to go back to before, you're testing the memory banks here. You have to go back to, I believe, before 2014. We also had some seasonal capacity in place with Texas Gas that was only for 1 or 2 months in the wintertime. And then the contract expired. So it was very short term. So there's considerable flexibility in contracting with interstate pipelines. You just have to evaluate it all in the context of their tariff and what you think your requirements are going to be over time and how you assess the market.
Okay. In response to Commission staff's first request for information, item 11B, and you can pull that up, Brenda, if you don't mind. Thank you. I'll wait till she pulls that up so you kind of have it in front of you.
Well, we're waiting for her to pull this up. Once the witness answers this question, we're going to take a break till about 11 o'clock, then you can continue your cross-exam.
There, if you could scroll to the next page, page 2 of 3, Brenda. You mentioned, Mr. Murphy, 2 scenarios in which LG&E could be required to pay more than the FERC-approved rate. And I believe this is referring to transmission costs. Is that correct? It would be transmission and demand costs under the FERC rate, basically, correct?
Correct, yes,
Those 2 scenarios there, they're listed as A and B. To your knowledge, has either of those scenarios ever occurred with respect to LG&E?
A has not occurred, as I explained before. We do have a negotiated rate in place with Texas Gas. That Lebanon contract that moves gas from the Marcellus to the Utica is a negotiated rate agreement. And so that rate is fixed irrespective of whether the pipeline changes its tariff rates upwards or downwards. And so there is some risk that had Texas Gas's rates been reviewed in the context of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that the rate that we had entered into at the time could have been in excess of the tariff rate had FERC required them to lower that rate. So the potential is there, but it's not happened so far. We still have, that contract expires in 2026, so we still have the risk that could happen in a subsequent rate review of Texas Gas's rates.
Okay. Do you want to take a break?
Are you done with that?
Yeah, I'm done with that question.
Okay, so we will recess until 11 o'clock, and at that point, Mr. Bellamy can continue his cross-examination. We're in recess for now.
unmuted.
Okay, we are back on the record, and Mr. Bellamy, would you like to continue your cross-examination?
Yes. Mr. Murphy, I was just going to move on to the off-system sales index factor, and that's the third factor of the PBR, correct?
That's correct.
And this basically is intended to capture the net revenues generated by LG&E from the off-system sales, correct?
That's correct.
Could you, at tariff page 87.8, I just had a question about some language that was being added.
Yes, sir.
Let's see. Would you mind pulling that up, Brenda, on the screen? So there, where it says that language, all system sales and storage service transactions made for operational and administrative reasons are not subject to benchmarking under the OSFIF component of the PBR mechanism. What's the purpose of this change?
The purpose of the change is really to, in cases where we would make an administrative release of capacity to an asset manager, for example, that would be an administrative reason, or because we needed to force balance the system by making an off-system sale that we could not make through the changes that we had available in our supply agreements, to exclude those from the benchmark, or exclude those from the benchmarking under this component. That's really, that should be the same or very similar to the language in Columbia's tariff.
What to you is meant by operational reasons and administrative reasons?
Well,
How would you define
again,
those terms?
an operational reason would be a case where, so an example, a case where we had gas flowing on the system. Our contract did not allow us to change the volume. The load decreased to the point where we had no place for the gas to go, either into our on-system or off-system storage, and we needed to basically get rid of the gas for operational reasons. And if we had to do that at a loss, then that would not be benchmarked, for any reason, loss or otherwise, loss or savings, that would not be benchmarked under the mechanism. An administrative reason, so it's a operational is, you could say, balancing. An operational balancing reason would if an extra word helps that. An administrative reason could be, and again, same example, if you entered into an asset management arrangement and you release the capacity to an asset manager or to a third party, that would not be benchmarked under the mechanism either. Sometimes you enter into those arrangements for other reasons, and those asset management arrangements, neither one of these two cases have ever applied to us. But again, we saw it in Columbia's tariff and thought it would be good or advisable to include it in ours as well.
Okay, so this has never occurred, so
This has never occurred.
could you take a look at your response to staff's second request for information, item 3? And you indicated there
Okay,
I'm sorry?
I'm with you.
Okay. And you indicated there, given the robust design of LG&E's PBR mechanisms, LG&E sharing mechanisms should be at least favorable as the sharing mechanisms of the other two LDCs. This would allow LG&E to complete the transition apparently contemplated in the Commission's order in case number 2014-476, which stated that the change proposed by LG&E was too abrupt. Therefore, this application, LG&E is requesting to complete the transition to the sharing mechanism proposed in case 2014-476. When you're talking there, what is the proposed change you're referring to there?
So the change in the sharing mechanism, I believe that's the same question that Mr. West asked me. It's described in the report at page, bear with me, at page 14. So just to recite that, we had asked in the previous case to establish the first threshold at 2%, where there would be a 30/70 savings in favor of the customer, and benchmark gas costs in excess of that, or the savings in excess of 2% of the benchmark gas costs would be shared at 50/50. So in the Commission's last order, they moved Partway, they moved to 3%. We're just asking to complete the transition. So that it's really outlined there on page 14 and the top of 15 of the report. Does that answer your
report,
question?
I think you mentioned that the increase, or that the risk justifies that the fact that your all's program is more risky than the other LDCs justifies that your percentage be similar to the other LDCs. Is there any other reason why you could give for increasing that percentage or increasing the sharing by lowering the percentage?
So I think you've got three reasons. I believe that our mechanism is more robust. I believe that as a matter of equity, the sharing mechanisms based on that should be similar. But I also think that because we do have an incentive mechanism, that when you change the benchmarks or the sharing mechanism in the ways we've described in the report and in the tariff sheets, you tend to increase the reward and therefore the risk-taking that produces benefits for savings, produces benefits for customers and for shareholders. Because I think part of the things that we've lost here is we've been very focused on what the company receives as its reward in response to the incentives that are given, but we've ignored the benefits that have been achieved for the customer that would not have been achieved absent the PBR mechanism. And so if you look back at Appendix A, we've been very focused on the $7 million that the company has received and pretty much ignored the $13.7 million in benefits that the customers have received. So again, if you change the benchmarks, some skepticism was expressed over including NYMEX. You change the benchmarks, you will also increase the benefits for the customer.
Okay. I guess the
Not
question
just-
though was just about the percentage, the lowering the sharing percentage down to 2% where it moves to 50%. And I think the reason for that was the difference in risk between LG&Es and the other LDCs. But
Well, my understanding that 2% is the same as as what the other LDCs have.
No, I understand, but I think your report, the justification was that because LG&E's program is more risky than the other LDCs, that the sharing should be at least equal to the other LDCs. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Risky or robust. I think robust might be a better word, but
In response to staff's first request for information, item 18, you provided tables comparing the gas cost incentive mechanisms of all the utilities in other jurisdictions that you're able to find. Is that correct?
bear with me just one moment. Sorry here.
You're fine.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you know whether gas cost incentive mechanisms were more prevalent in the past than they are now in terms of utilities in other states?
It's possible that some of these mechanisms went by the way as states removed the LDCs from merchant functions. I mean, obviously, if the LDC doesn't have a merchant function, there's no PBR mechanism. So some of these mechanisms could have fallen by the wayside in states, for example, like Ohio, where some of the LDCs are out of the merchant function.
So you're saying that they have decreased, you think, but it's because they've gone to where the customer can pick where they're purchasing the gas from?
Right, retail competition. So I think that's one thing that's important to understand about some of the background for these PBR mechanisms is they came about at a time when the regulator was trying to encourage local distribution companies to become more competitive in the wake of retail choice. And the advantage of the mechanism over retail choice is that you still have objective and transparent benchmarks that are subject to regulatory scrutiny, unlike the what I would call free-for-all associated with a retail choice program.
Okay. Would you agree, if you could take a look at your response to staff's second request, item 11E? Just let me know when you're there.
Yes, sir.
And there's mentions of mechanisms of other state. And would you confirm that you responded to item 11E, that the mechanisms approved in California and Tennessee are the most similar to LG&E's?
That's correct. That's what it says, yes.
Can you kind of summarize the similarities and differences between those two, between the programs in Tennessee and California and LG&E's mechanism?
Well, you're benchmarking the same kinds of costs. So you reviewed earlier, or really all this morning, the three main elements. So the gas commodity, the pipeline transportation, and all system sales. So it's similar in that it provides for benchmarking of those three activities. It's dissimilar in the fact that it includes, I believe this is the one that includes a cap to the mechanism. If I could refer back and refresh my memory. Right, this includes a cap to the overall proceeds under the mechanism. I believe in question 1-18 for those ones in California, it was 1.5% of benchmark gas costs. and there was a dollar figure for the Tennessee one. So it's unlike those, and really from the perspective of the customer, those kinds of caps and whether it's a percentage or whether it's a dollar amount do nothing more than create a disincentive for the utility to perform. So I would use this analogy. I go to the casino. The lady at the door tells me I can stay as long as I want, I can play as many games as I want, and I can bet as much as I want. But when I'm done, I can only leave with $50. A logical person who has gone to the casino, once they had won $50, would leave. And so putting a cap or whether it's a percentage or whether it's a dollar amount on the savings on the portion of the savings that the company keeps, does nothing more than put a cap on, or whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage on the portion that the customer keeps. So caps limit the benefits to customers in the same way they limit benefits to the company.
So in your opinion, is there any reasonable way to include a cap or limit on utility sharing within a performance-based rate mechanism?
It's been my firm belief, in having operated under this mechanism for 23 years, that tinkering with the benchmarks under the mechanism, and I appreciate that the commission is concerned that this mechanism is some kind of get-rich-quick scheme. I disagree with that. But I appreciate the commission's concern, but tinkering with the benchmarks of the mechanism do nothing but create potential disincentives to superior performance or to reliability. I think the commission would be better advised to look at the sharing mechanism and, for example, in our case, complete the transition to the 2% level, but perhaps tinker with the upper bound over the 2%, where we proposed 50-50, to perhaps consider, instead of 50-50 split evenly between the customer and the company, to go to a 40-60 in favor of the customer. I think that would still incent, in some degree, maybe not to the same degree, but in some degree, superior performance that would be disincented by a cap.
So you say it would be better to increase the sharing percentage in favor of the customer than it would be to put a cap in place, correct?
Well, let me be specific, lest you paraphrase me too much. So we proposed in this mechanism that savings or expenses up to 2% of the benchmark gas costs be split 30-70. In excess of the 2%, they be split 50-50. What I'm suggesting is to leave the 30-70, the 2% and the 30-70 that we proposed alone, and tinker with the upper bound over the 2% level. So instead of 50-50, it would be 40-60 in favor of the customer. I think that would continue to provide an incentive to the company without detriment to the customer.
And that was my point. I didn't mean, my point was your thing, if, as opposed to a hard cap, you think a more appropriate response would be to change the sharing percentages on that upper bound.
On the upper bound, yes. I do. I will have to say again, I think a cap does nothing to help the customer. I think the cap I have to use my casino example. If all I can win is $50, then I'm leaving the room. When I've got $50, I leave. And that is not beneficial to the customer.
Could you explain the tolerance band used in the mechanism of Pacific Gas and Electric in California, if you're familiar with it?
I'm sorry, which question was that again? I apologize.
I don't know if
Was it
anything, I don't think it
111?
referred to a specific question, but it did refer to some of the research you've done on other performance-based rate mechanisms, and Pacific Gas and Electric in California has a tolerance band that's used, and I was just curious if you're familiar with it.
Let me go back and look at that item 18. I have to. So you're referring to, I think, to question number 1-18, page 1 of 3 there in row 6.
Yes, I believe so.
So again, tolerance band is just a way to remove an incentive. So a tolerance band, and in some ways the current mechanism has a tolerance band because the lower band is shared at 1% more in favor of the company, more in favor of the customer, 30/70, whereas the upper band, which that's a threshold, is in favor of 50/50 is how we propose it. So this goes on to say costs above the tolerance band are shared 50/50. Savings below, savings below the tolerance band are shared 80/20. So as I read this is very similar to LG&E's, where our tolerance band is 2%. That's really what the 2% is a tolerance band that acts to separate the portion that's saved at one level versus the portion that's saved at another.
Okay. Do you believe that the rising levels of gas utility base rates have any impact on the necessity or the relevance of PBR mechanisms?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yeah, do you believe that increases in gas utility base rates have any impact on the necessity and the relevance of gas cost PBR mechanisms?
I think they illustrate, as they've always illustrated, the importance of trying to wring savings out of the acquisition, out of the PBR mechanism. So we should always try to keep customers' prices in a reasonable fashion. So to the extent that the PBR mechanism can help offset increases in base rates, that would seem to me to be a good thing.
Do you have any opinion regarding why PBRs are not more prevalent in other jurisdictions?
I come back to what I said at the beginning, and that they're voluntary. So I believe that many LDCs would not want to subject themselves to the risks under the mechanism. I think that's why you see what you see, is that there's not that many companies that have these kinds of mechanisms, because not many LDCs want to subject themselves to this kind of risk. They would rather, for lack of a better term, sail along on the least cost acquisition standard and not try to achieve superior performance.
And I just want to change gears really quick. Going back to the TIF component in the tariff sheet, which is on tariff sheet 87.5. The
Yes, sir.
There, you've got the benchmark monthly gas transportation cost, which is then used to determine the benchmark for the year. And it's the sum of three costs, the BMTGT, the BMTGPL, and then the BMPPL. And you mentioned that you all have only 2 transmission lines from which you all can currently receive transportation services. So I'm curious, what is this BMPPL that's included in the benchmark?
This was included in the mechanism at a time, so we have to go back to 96, where we were trying to keep the mechanism as broadly constructed as possible, that in the event that we, and it's not happened in 23 years, right? In the event that we would hook up with another pipeline, we could use the mechanism, which there's not one handy, we could use the mechanism as it stood rather than to go back and seek reapproval of the mechanism to put in whatever this unknown pipeline's name might be.
So this currently has no effect on it. It would only come into effect if you had a third connection.
No, it's an unfortunate accident that that PPL happens to be this is proxy pipeline. This is not anything to do with our parent. Unfortunate accident of acronyms. So it's never come into play.
Okay.
Nor at this point do I anticipate that it would come into play.
That's fine. I don't have any other questions about it. But in post-hearing, or in request for information, and I think even in here, you testified that it's not possible to break up the O&M costs associated with gas procurement. Is it possible to provide just the total gas procurement cost each year for the PBR years of 2019 through 2022 without the any difference being broken out for what would be done differently if there was PBR versus there wasn't PBR or PBR?
You're just talking about the departmental O&M?
Yes.
That's possible with some caveat, and that is because we would have to remove some charges, and I'm not sure how we would do this exactly, that are associated with gas transportation activities by customers, because we also administer rates FT and Rider TS2, so we have some costs that are incurred as a part of that program. So not all of our departmental costs are associated with purchased gas costs. Some are associated with end user transportation.
And I would understand that. But I guess as a post-hearing data request, could you provide the cost for the department for years, PBR years 19 through 22, and if there's an estimate that you have to make or an assumption, or if there's some cost that's still in there that you couldn't remove, you can note that and kind of note how much that would be about.
All right.
And then lastly, I had one more question. Just again, as a post-hearing data request, could you provide the net income, the PBR profit, and the PBR percentage of net income under the PBR for each year from 2010 to present? I think some of those have been provided, so it would basically be the years before that, what has been provided already.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah,
Net income?
basically the net income or the net savings, or expense from the PBR for each year, from 2010 to present, and then the percentage of that as to the total cost for each year from 2010 to present.
I wonder if we could go back and refer to one of the exhibits and make sure I'm,
Let me interrupt just a second, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Bellamy, I want to make sure, I've been assuming, but I probably shouldn't do that, that the hearing data requests that staff is asking, will those be reduced to writing?
We'll put
and
them in
then-
writing, so.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
thank you.
Everything will be established, that staff will provide it, and we will establish a date for it to be provided, and your responses due.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So I can just clarify that in writing, sir, and you know, you
Mr.
can
Bellamy,
answer
are you asking me to provide data? If you look at Appendix A to the report, I want to make sure I understand what your question is before I agree to answer it. You're asking me to provide data that's on Appendix A of the report that goes back however many years before
Yes,
what's
sir.
shown here,
Back to 2010, if that would be possible.
but it's the same data, these same percentages by year.
Yes, let me just double check. Let's see. Yes, I believe that is it.
Because that's a percentage of the total savings. So if we could just plod through this for a second, that's a percentage in column 5 of the total savings in column 1 divided by the total benchmark gas costs under the mechanism.
Yes, that's correct.
That's not just the shareholder portion, that's the total portion that accrues to the company and the customer, that percentage.
And that is what we wanted, yes.
Okay,
And I don't have any other questions. Thank you very much for your time.
thank you.
Chairman Smith,
I have no questions.
Commissioner Matthews, I think she's out there somewhere. She may have lost power. Commissioner Matthews, you out there? Okay, well,
Appreciate
I
it.
am. I don't have any questions.
you have no questions?
I have no questions.
Okay, so I only have a couple of questions. And it has to do with the savings associated with the transmission. I think you said you have 2 providers and you put out a bid, a request for proposal, and the bid came in and you received a discount that ended up in approximately out to 2026 savings below the FERC rate, which is generating about $2.5 million a year. And of that $2.5 million, taking the last percentage I see out there, about 38%, that generates about $1 million a year for LG&E. Is that right? My calculation right?
Are you referring to,
The TIF.
are you referring to a particular exhibit or?
Well, I'm looking at the year 22, the TIF is 2.456 million. I don't
Okay,
know what.
yes.
What exhibit that happens to be, but it's basically $207,000 or $216,700 or somewhere around that number per year that's being generated, not per year, per month, it's being generated because of a discount off the FERC rate that you've entered into with one of your suppliers. Is that right?
Correct, that's our Tennessee contract, and that contract goes through 2023 is my recollection.
So in all of your responses, you talked about the risk that the company takes but wouldn't take in the future if there wasn't an incentive, or at least it would be more difficult to be justified. Is that basically an accurate statement?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Well, but let me take it a step further and we'll go from there. When this agreement was entered into with a discount below the FERC on the contract that you have out of only one of two potential suppliers, you entered into that agreement, which I would think putting a request for proposal out to bid to only two suppliers would be in the normal course of a management's business process. And so you put out this bid and you received a rate below FERC's benchmark, and you're now generating approximately $1 million a year, and I'm trying to figure out what the extra resources were required or what the risk was that generates this extra $1 million a year in savings.
Well, so first of all, I think we should be aware that this is the pipeline that has not increasing rates over time, but decreasing rates over time. So these amounts, unlike other LDCs that may have contracts and their pipeline rates are going up, we know that under this particular contract with this particular pipeline, that there's an approved set of rate reductions in effect that are scheduled to occur over time. So this $2.456 million does not go on year after year. It will decline. So that's an important distinction from other LDCs. And I think the other thing that should be borne in mind is that these savings accrue to the customer and to the company, not just to the company. And so the customer is getting the benefit. The fact that we have an interconnection with Tennessee does increase our O&M costs because we have to do transmission work on those pipelines. So it's not like the transportation arrangement comes without cost or risk. So I think to look at it in the vacuum, I'm saying we're getting a percentage of the $2.5 million, doesn't look at the whole kettle of fish. And importantly, just because we have, as I mentioned before, that not only the rates going down, there's no obligation for LG&E to be interconnected with this pipeline unless there is some operational reason to do so. And there's no reason for us to expect that they will be able to continue discounting the rate, assuming that the marketplace changes in the ways that we've seen in the past by increasing demand from electric generation, from LNG, from exports to Mexico. So this is not a ride on the gravy train. This is something we were able to capture at this point in time.
You entered into a long-term agreement, is that right, through 2026?
No, sir, to 2023.
2023, I'm sorry. So you've entered into an agreement through 2023, correct?
That's correct. I believe that's the correct date, October 31st of 2023.
And does the discount in the contract change, or is it set?
The discount is set, but we're subject to all additional surcharges and fees. So it's a discount of the base rate. It is not a discount of the commodity. It is not a discount of any surcharge. It's not a discount of any fuel factor. And the tariff rates against which the savings are measured are declining.
And they're declining because of what factor?
They're declining because the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that has jurisdiction over pipeline rates conducted an investigation of interstate pipelines as a part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And they reviewed the pipeline rates and found them to be too high, and Tennessee entered into a settlement with its customers, which was approved by FERC to lower those rates in a manner specified in the report. So I draw your attention to the report on page 10, footnote 4. And that says, in the case of Tennessee, FERC approved a settlement among Tennessee and its customers to resolve all income tax issues and provide for lower pipeline rates as follows. An immediate reduction of 8.5% effective November 1, 2019, followed by 3 further reductions. A 2% reduction effective November 1, 2020, a 2% reduction effective November 1, 2021, a 1% reduction effective November 1, 2022. All the reductions are expressed as a percentage of the rates in effect as of November 1, 2018.
Okay, so known and measurable changes due to the FERC ruling, is that correct?
Absent some change in the surcharge or other surcharges and direct bills associated with that, that's correct.
So FERC mandated a 13% decrease over the next 3 years. What are the surcharges that you may be subject to?
There is a pipeline safety and greenhouse gas surcharge. Those amounts are called out in one of the data requests. There is a PCB surcharge, which is currently 0, but if it goes into effect, then we would be subject to it. And there are fuel surcharges that are approved by FERC as well. Those are not subject to the discount, and we would continue to pay those. That's why the tariff sheet is constructed in the way that it's constructed, so that the surcharges and direct bills are called out separately.
Okay, so if I take 2 point, you'd still be generating about $2 million a year, even if the change was 20% for an activity that occurred, I don't know how long ago, for asking for a discount from from 2 suppliers, and you ended up, you're generating 2 million times 0.38. So you're still going to generate about $750,000 for shareholders for this activity, and that's going forward with all of the changes that you've indicated on the rate due to a FERC ruling and due to potential surcharges. I was generous. I
have not calculated those numbers. I can't verify that.
That's all right. They're the numbers that I calculated, and it's just for a matter of estimating. My other comment is, the only risk that was taken by LG&E to generate this is they put out a request for proposal. There's no risk. There's no chance of you losing money on it. That risk doesn't exist.
And in the absence of taking bids, we could have contracted at the FERC rate, the rate that is approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the body having jurisdiction. And the regulatory arena is designed to set a market default rate where there is not adequate competition or where one of the parties has monopoly power. And that is the situation that we are in.
All right, I'm only going to make 2 other comments. With regard to the O&M and the Tennessee pipeline costs, are those not included in rates at the current time? Since you already know that you're purchasing this gas from that location, have you not built into rates the O&M costs?
You're talking about the O&M rates and costs associated with our department?
The O&M associated with purchasing from that location. I think you alluded to that there were certain O&M costs that you incurred as a result of utilizing the Tennessee pipeline, a different location.
Right, and whether or not those contracts were there or not there, the activity of purchasing gas goes on. That is recovered through rates. That is the what of what we do in the department. We buy gas, we buy transportation capacity. What the PBR mechanism does is change the how. It changes the how we buy gas, how we buy transportation capacity. It incents us to outperform the least cost acquisition or prudence standard.
Well, for the record, we've already established, I think for my benefit, how you're doing it and the risk associated with it. I'm going to use your casino example, and you said if you were limited by a $50 win that you would stop once you hit $50, but usually people that go into casinos use their own money. In this case, LG&E gets to utilize somebody else's money. There's no cost to them for this mechanism to be in place. So I understand your comment, but it's not exactly the same scenario.
And if there were not the opportunity of winning at the casino, I would not go in the first place to try to win the $50.
With all due respect, LG&E has a monopoly over their customers. It's a different scenario totally.
And we are exceeding the least cost acquisition standard courtesy of the PBR mechanism.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. I have no other questions. Mr. Ingram, do you have some redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, just a little bit. Mr. Murphy, I know in response to Mr. Bellamy's question about the expenses in gas procurement that are embedded in customer rates, that you don't know the exact numbers there. But can you say whether the expenses of your department would change regardless of whether there was a PBR mechanism for gas procurement?
No, those expenses would remain unchanged because they cover the what of our activity, not the how.
Okay, so does that mean that customers can pay nothing additional and still receive the savings that they've been receiving all these years under the PBR mechanism?
No, that does not mean that. It means that we would continue to procure pipeline and transportation capacity in accordance with the least cost acquisition standard, not following the directives that are incented through the PBR mechanism.
But for what, okay. Did you watch the hearing a few weeks ago in the Columbia PBR mechanism case?
I did.
Can you recall there was a discussion in that hearing, and I think there was maybe a reference to it in today's hearing about the level of incentive that is appropriate for a utility to receive to encourage the savings that are possible out there.
Yes.
Do you recall that in examining the level of that incentive, one of the pieces of data that one might look at is the PBR savings that are achieved as a percentage of the utility's net income?
Yes, my recollection that one of the questions by the commission staff, by the commission attorneys, asserted that that percentage was, for Columbia, 25% of their net income. I know that Columbia responded to that. I have calculated a similar number for LG&E over the 4-year period that is under review here, and that percentage is something under 3.5%.
And is that on an after-tax basis, Mr. Murphy?
That is on an after-tax basis. That's comparable to how Columbia calculated it, so that we're comparing apples to apples. I would go on to say that since we're so heavily focused on LG&E's sharing in the mechanism and ignoring the benefit that the customer gets, but our sharing percentage is about 1.5% of total benchmark gas costs. It's about 1% of the total gas supply cost rate. So it's de minimis compared to others you might compare us to?
Your Honor, Mr. Murphy's already covered, anything that I might have on a redirect, so I have no further redirect of him.
Thank you. Mr. West, do you have any other questions?
I do not have any further questions for this witness.
Mr. Bellamy, are you complete?
No further questions, thank you.
Okay, Chairman,
No questions.
may this witness be excused? Witness is excused. Mr. Ingram, do you have another witness?
I do, Your Honor. The company's other witness is Ms. Pam Janes. Now, Mr. Murphy did not refer any of the questions he received to her, so I'm not sure if there are any questions for her, but certainly she is ready to testify if there are questions for her.
Well, let's swear in and see if anyone has any questions, and if not, then we can just move forward.
Thank you. Call Ms. Pam Janes.
Good morning, or afternoon, whatever it is. Would you raise
Good
your right-
afternoon.
Would you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Ingram, you may ask.
Ms. Janes, would you please state your full name for the record?
Sure, Pamela Lee James.
And could you tell us what your job title is and job address is, please?
Yes, it's manager gas supply, and I'm located at 820 West Broadway, Louisville, Kentucky.
And you did not file any direct testimony in this case, did you?
I did not.
But you were identified on a number of data requests that were issued to the company. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if I were to ask you the same questions here today that were asked of you in those data requests, would your responses be the same?
Yes.
Ms. James is available for cross-examination, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. West?
I have no questions.
Mr. Bellamy?
Commission staff has no questions.
Chairman Smith?
No questions.
Commissioner Matthews?
I have no questions.
I have no questions. I presume, Mr. Ingram, you have no questions as well?
I have no redirect.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. James, for you to be sworn in. Let us get your picture on the record. You may be excused. So, at this point, I don't think there was any exhibits. Is that correct? Nobody had any exhibits, right, Mr.
No,
Bellamy?
sir.
All right, so there were some post-hearing data requests, and Mr. Bellamy, can you have those ready by June 29th?
Yes.
Okay, and Mr. Ingram, can you respond by July 9th?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, and I don't, do you plan on filing any type of a brief, Mr. Ingram?
Well, I think what we'd like to do, if it's okay with the commission, is at least put in a deadline for such a brief. We may or may not file one, but if it suits, we'd like at least to have a deadline, and then we will let Mr. Bellamy know just as soon as we can whether we think we will file a brief. Is that suitable?
That's suitable. Chairman, you have the calendar there. If they do the July 9th, what's a good date for, let's see here. July 9th is a Thursday. How long do you think you need to file a brief?
Whatever suits the commission, we'll get it done. That doesn't matter. You all can pick the date.
July 16th? That's
Sure.
another week. Is that acceptable?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, so we'll do it for July 16th. Okay, is there any other business, or are we all set?
Company has nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. If that being the case, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.